Shalom, everyone. It's time for ancient Jewish wisdom for a modern world that will change your thinking and change your life. Welcome to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Brian Baruch Balechi.
Shalom, everyone. This is Rabbi Brian. I'm so glad to be with you again for another Q&A episode. And this is episode 9, and we're going to have a really fun time talking about a great question that has come in. If you've been watching the podcast, rating and reviewing, letting us know that you love the program, you love the content, or even sharing the content with friends and family, we want to thank you. I want to say Todah Rabbah. I want to thank you for being a part of the Dust of the Rabbi podcast. So without further ado, let's talk about the topic of the day as we've been talking about Jesus, or in Hebrew, Yeshua, as a rabbi. He is Yeshua HaMashiach. We believe he's the Messiah. And for many people that are looking for the Messiah, one of the great ways to learn about the Messiah is to learn that he's a rabbi and learn from his teaching. So I'm so grateful to be with you. I'm ready to jump into a fun topic. And this one is based upon a question that came in about, can we be the salt of the earth? And I think one of the topics that touches my heart so deeply is one of being a disciple of Yeshua. That's very important for me, to be a rabbi and model myself after the rabbi of all rabbis, the rabbi of the first century, who was a Torah teacher and scholar and had 12 disciples that he discipled fully to be perfectly like him, to follow in his footsteps. As we talk about sitting at the feet of a Torah scholar and drinking in their words with thirst, we become dusty with the dust of the rabbi. So what does it mean to be the salt of the earth? I bet you've heard this a million times, either in Sunday school class, if you're a Christian, or maybe even if you're from the Jewish synagogue and you grew up in Sunday school, which was literally the first day of education for Jewish learning. And I want you to think about whether you're a person of faith or you're a person that's just inquisitive. You've probably heard this term being used, people who are the salt of the earth. And we think about salt in different ways. So I'm going to read a passage and then we'll talk about the purpose of salt. But we're specifically going to go back to the first century and understand, not only in the times of Jesus, but even in the times of Moses, what salt was used for. Okay, here we go. We're going to jump into this lesson. I'm going to look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. This is what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And it includes not only the Beatitudes at the top of the chapter, which I'd love to get into in a rich teaching one of these episodes, but I want to look at specifically today to answer a specific question, Matthew 5:13. The Tree of Life version reads this way: "You are the salt of the earth. And if the salt should lose its flavor, how should it be salty again? It can no longer be good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." When you listen to the words of Jesus, this rabbi, Yeshua, you actually think about a lot of things that he says in light of the way you live, the day and times that you're living in, how words are used in today's vernacular. We often forget what it means to the original audience through this author, Matthew, this tax collector who becomes a follower of Jesus. And especially hearing Jesus speak to his audience, we have to consider, what did he mean and how did they understand it? Because the goal is to have ears to hear and a heart to understand the deep things of God. And only through the Spirit of God can we understand the deeper meaning. So I want you to step away from anything you've ever understood this verse to mean and really become a student again, become a disciple of Yeshua, not just a follower, not just a listener, not just someone who's following this podcast, but as I'm trying to model myself after Yeshua, the rabbi, I want you to allow yourself to sit at the feet of this teaching, drink in the words of the passage with thirst, and learn as you listen with ears that can hear so that you can have a heart that will understand. And here's what it says again: you are the salt of the earth. Now remember, he's speaking to crowds of people, multitudes of people, but yet it's only his disciples that he's really focused on understanding this concept. You're going to find out that this is one of the secrets to being a disciple of Yeshua, to being a disciple who's disciplined in certain spiritual areas of discipline. So when you think about this passage, You are the salt of the earth. You have to realize this is not the only place that it's recorded that Jesus said these words. And the Greek there in the text is very interesting. Alastisis. Now, yis, spelled with the letter gamma, which is pronounced not like our American G, but gets translated as a G sound, is where we actually get the word geo or geology. So it could refer to earth, land, or soil. So alastisis is in the Greek. The Hebrew translation, the original concept from this Jewish rabbi, would have been different in the way it's referenced. It would actually be malach haaretz, which is the salt of the earth. Now, aretz, which is earth, can also be translated land and soil, even the concept of ground. So think about the farmer that Jesus was speaking to many times in his parables. Think about the agricultural cycle of Israel, and think about how important it is for the earth to have good soil, fertilized soil, fertile soil for plants and crops to grow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare this reference of the salt of the earth in Matthew 5:13 with the other two places we will find it. We find it in the other two synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four gospels, but only Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered synoptic. Synoptic meaning they have a similar optical view of the words and teachings of Jesus. John's a little different in his style, and you'll notice that John seems to not follow the same pattern, but being the youngest of the group, the youngest of the disciples, he seems to have a very unique perspective of Jesus because he was close to him, the one Jesus loved, who rested on his chest like a young brother would to an older brother. So when you think about how important this is in the text, you have to look at the other Gospels to get that synoptical view of what Jesus is saying. So I'm going to start with looking at Luke chapter 14 to show you how it's connected to being a disciple. Jesus said this, "So in the same way, whoever does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." Now, he just ran through mother and father, brother and sister, and all the things of this world that we can use as excuses to not follow him. He says, you got to let go of all that. And then in verse 34, he says, "Therefore, salt is good." Kind of like out of the blue, he starts talking about salt. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, its savor, its richness, how shall it be made salty again? Think about in the days of Jesus and the disciples and families that were going to the marketplace. They were looking for good quality salt because good quality salt never loses its savor or flavor, but lower grade salt does. So I want you to think about this verse here where he says, salt is good, but if it loses its flavor, how shall it be made salty again? Almost like it's impossible. Verse 35 says, "For it is not suitable for the soil or for a manure heap. It is thrown out." And it says, "He who has an ear to hear, let him hear." So think about the two things that are referenced here. Because most of us, when we think of salt, we think about seasoning our food with salt. We may think of salt as a preservative. You might even think of salt in reference to hydration, because salty food can make you thirsty. The Bible does tell us to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and you will be fulfilled. Right there in the beginning of the chapter, in the Beatitudes, it says, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled, and they are blessed if they hunger and thirst. But remember, the text says the salt of the earth. It doesn't say the salt of your food, and it doesn't say the salt of your meat. So it's not referring to salt or a salt shaker at the dinner table. And I often use sea salt or some type of rich salt, like a Celtic salt, to be able to season my food because I want all the minerals. And that's different from table salt. So we have to remove ourselves from table salt because in biblical times, salt was coming from the sea. And many times they take the salt water and put it into a pit or into an area where it can evaporate. The water will evaporate, and what's left is these salt particles or rocks. Salt rock to be able to make salt from, and they would sell it in the marketplace. In fact, many Roman soldiers were paid with salt. That's where we get the word salary from. Think about sal in Spanish, sal. And this salary or salarium was actually what was used to pay Roman soldiers. It was a very important commodity in the biblical days. It was so important that if you go all the way back to the days of Moses, You couldn't even have a sacrifice offered to God, whether it is grain or whether it is an animal from the field, like a lamb or a goat or a ram or a bull, without salt. You had to season everything with salt. It's very clear when you read the passages in the Bible that talk about the sacrifices, as in Leviticus 2:13. It says, "And you are to season with salt every sacrifice and grain offering. You are never to allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering with all your sacrifices." Think about all those meat offerings. The sacrifices must be offered with salt. It's also said in Numbers 18:19, whatever is set aside from the holy offerings that Bnei Israel, the people of Israel, are going to present to the Lord, it says, "I have given it to you and your sons and your daughters for a permanent share." He says it's an everlasting covenant of salt before Adonai, your God, and your offering. Now, think about this. Very important when you think about salt. If you invite someone over for a meal, if you don't have salt at the table or haven't seasoned the food, they're going to think that you are the worst friend ever. So whenever you made a covenant, whether a covenant with God or had a covenant friendship, a friendship of loyalty, you always had salt as a symbol of the covenant between you and that person. In fact, the salt gave it flavor. The salt made it taste good. It was so pleasurable that when you think about even certain basic foods, even down to an egg, it says in the book of Job, chapter 6, verse 6, Job says this, "Is something bland eaten without salt? Is there taste in the white of an egg?" Think about this. Even the white of an egg has no flavor until you put some salt on it. I love boiled eggs. And beitza, Hebrew word for egg, very popular in Israel. I can't imagine people eating eggs without salt. I can't imagine the priests offering sacrifices without salt. I can't imagine people having a covenant meal together in friendship and loyalty to that friend and not salt the meat or have salt at the table. It was a symbol of a covenant. And that's a great aspect. That's what we normally think of. We think about seasoning our food. I want you to know that there's much more to this text because it's not just about the dinner table, although we know the sacrifices needed salt. In fact, we can go all the way back to the book of Genesis, where Lot's wife became a pillar of salt from the Dead Sea. That's the first reference to salt is the Dead Sea. It's actually in Hebrew not called Dead Sea, but it's called the Sea of Salt or the Salt Sea. It's actually called Yam HaMelach, because melach is salt and yam is sea. And we call it the Dead Sea, but it's really the Salt Sea. You think about in Genesis 19, where Lot's wife becomes a pillar of salt, she looked back at the past instead of looking forward to the future. She looked back in disobedience instead of focusing her faith in obedience towards God. So there's a lot to say about salt. But I want to specifically know why Jesus said these words. I want to go back to Luke's passage in chapter 14 and talk about the words in verse 35. So it says, therefore, it is not suitable for the soil or the manure heap, or what the King James calls the dunghill. Now, you have to know, this is very specific, both referring to the soil. Okay, verse 35 says, it's not suitable for the soil. That's the same Greek word, yis, where we get the word geology. Yis is the word earth, land, or soil. The same exact Greek word that is used in the concept of alastisis. And this is the salt of the earth, or the salt of the land, or the salt of the soil. Oh my goodness. Now we understand what Jesus is saying when he says, you are the salt of the earth. He's really saying you are the salt of the soil. So this is not a culinary salt. This is an agricultural salt. In other words, just like he's going to say in the next passage, he's going to talk about us being not only salt, but light. And I can't get into that too much today. I don't have time for that. But if you think about salt, without the salt, the soil is not going to be enriched with its minerals. And without light, the plant cannot grow from that rich soil. So we are to be both salt and light. But specifically, it's not the salt of the food. It's not the salt of the bread. And even rabbis say, when you sit down and have a meal together, you should always dip your bread in salt. Again, it's a sign of that loyal friendship and covenant between you and that person. But that's not what Jesus is referring to. He's not saying the salt of your meat or the salt of your bread. He's talking about the salt of the soil, the salt of the land. And then he also talks about the dunghill or the manure heap. This is not referring to necessarily animal dung. This is actually referring to human dung. So one of the ways to keep the land clean is to use salt, not just like a preservative on meat, but as an antiseptic and something to kind of cleanse the ground. And so even down to a birth of a child, when the child comes out of the mother's womb, they would not only swaddle the baby in swaddling clothes like they did Jesus, but the book of Ezekiel tells us that they would actually wash the baby and salt the baby, because this salt bath would cleanse anything that would be unclean after the birth. Because in those days, they didn't have hospitals, they had midwives, and they had to have a way to use the salt as an antiseptic to cleanse the baby. In the same way, they would use this salt to cleanse the soil. So if you think about it, salt in a right measure can actually do good, but salt in the wrong measure can do harm, because the Bible tells us that in a salt land, nothing can grow. So too much salt is not good, but just enough salt is perfect. Now I know why Jesus said this to his disciples, because if I actually read one more passage, I'm going to read Mark chapter 9, verse 50. It says, "The master warned his disciples here to not lose their saltiness, because salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again?" Another version of the tree of life in Mark 50 says, "Salt is good, but if the salt is unsalty, what will you flavor it with?" He says, "Have salt in yourselves and keep shalom with one another." In other words, there's a certain measure of salt that's good, but you got to also balance it with shalom. Have you ever had a salty person come talk to you and they are so salty in their conviction that they're telling you everything in the world that's wrong, and they're telling you everything that you should be doing that you're not doing, and they're telling you all this stuff that you should do, but maybe like the Pharisees, many of the Pharisees, they weren't doing it themselves? So he says specifically to his disciples, you have to have salt in your life, but make sure you have the balance of shalom. It's almost like the balance of salt even when you're cooking. Too much salt is not good, but just the right amount seasons it perfect. Whether it's the meat, whether it's that egg, whatever it is, you need the certain balance of salt. This is why the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul, this rabbi who was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews, he understood the purpose of salt. And in Colossians 3:12, he says, "Let your speech also be with grace, seasoned with salt, to know how you ought to answer anyone or answer everyone." So when you think about salt, in the right measure, it's good. And salt, yes, it preserves. And salt can purify. And salt can be an antiseptic. And salt can fix the soil. Did you know that you can actually use sea salt for fertilizer? In fact, there's potassium in there. In fact, this type of fertilizer, really why it's good is because in the sea salt, we have different minerals like magnesium and potassium, and we have what we call potash. It's actually the word that we get potassium from. It's this mineral that is very nutritious for our bodies. We need potassium. If you don't want to dehydrate, you need potassium in your life. You don't want to cramp in your muscles, you need potassium. And this sea salt that was the biblical salt of the day, not our table salt, but our sea salt that the Bible would use, had a mixture of minerals in it that was perfect for growth in plants. If you use just enough, they would usually sometimes have this salty water that used to affect the soil, because too much salt can kill everything where nothing can grow. But Jesus is saying his disciples, watch this, have the discernment on how to use just enough saltiness in their conversation, how much conviction in their conversation to not only keep the shalom in the friendship, in the relationship, but how to affect society, to be the salt of the soil. Because without the right potassium, without the right minerals, the food will not grow. In fact, it won't even have taste. You know, one of the reasons why a sea salt fertilizer is so powerful is because it makes all the vegetables, even the fruits, have a heightened taste. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. You want to have the salt of the food? You need the salt of the soil. Because we, as believers, as disciples of Yeshua, not just followers, but disciplined disciples of Yeshua, There's something about us being present in just the right amount in our conviction, in our shalom, in our ability to reconcile people back to God. We have salt in our conversation. We are like a salt shaker of salt, sometimes like a big measure of salt from a salt pit. We're kind of adding to the soil. And if there's any contaminants from the dunghill, we are the antiseptic. We are the one that cleanses the earth because we have the discipleship of Yeshua the Messiah in our hearts, in our minds, in our thoughts, in our words, in our actions. And just being present, people will change their conversation just because you're in the room. People will change their perspective in life just because of the influence you have. If you are the salt of the earth or the salt of the soil, you have the ability to not only make everything taste better, but you purify, you preserve, you cleanse, you make the soil of this earth better. So it's time for the true disciples of Yeshua to please stand up. You need to become the salt of the earth. You need to not only take this message in, but you need to apply it to your life. Let me share with you one other thing that I found very interesting. I'm going to read this little article about a certain rabbi who happens to have the same name as Yeshua the Messiah, but in the full Hebrew, Yehoshua. In this article, it says, "Can salt lose its salinity?" The Talmud records a debate between Rabbi Yehoshua and a school of Greek philosophers from Athens. In the course of the debate, the philosophers attempt to stump Rabbi Yehoshua with a series of riddles. At one point, they ask him, when salt becomes unsavory, how can it be made salty again? In other words, this was a riddle. And Rabbi Yehoshua answered the riddle with another riddle. Because it's a Jewish conversation, right? You answer a question with a question. That's being salty in your conversation. Don't get mad when people ask questions. Just ask them another question to make sure you're getting to the root question. Because you ask the right question to the right person at the right time, you're probably going to get the right answer. So you got to be salty in your questioning. Just don't accept everything at face value. Go a little deeper. Look what he says. He answers their question or their riddle with another riddle. He says, salt may be made salty again with the afterbirth of a mule. The philosophers object. Does a mule have an afterbirth? Now, everybody knows a mule is, kind of a hybrid. The horse and the donkey, kind of mixed together. You get a mule. And the mule is sterile. The mule cannot have any children. So this is kind of like on purpose a question the rabbi is asking to kind of stump his audience, just like Jesus, just like Yeshua did with the Pharisees that would question and corner him with their riddles, with their questions. He says mules are born sterile and therefore they do not reproduce or have afterbirth. Rabbi Yehoshua explains, can salt lose its saltiness then? Just as a mule cannot have afterbirth, the laws of chemistry make it impossible for salt to lose its saltiness. Now, this is what I love about being a disciple of Yeshua. He's telling you and I, if we will learn from his teachings of the Torah and from the prophets and from the Hebrew scriptures, and we download this ancient Jewish wisdom of his storytelling, of his parables, of his Sermon on the Mount, of his metaphors and similes and all of these anthropomorphic things used to describe God in the first century, if you will download his teaching and walk in his footsteps, you will be the kind of disciple that has discernment to not only have an ear to hear and eyes that can see, but a heart that can understand what it means to walk with the rabbi and become dusty from the dust of his feet. You will be able to be discipled and be perfectly trained. As it says in Luke 6:40, a disciple is not above his teacher or his rabbi, but one who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher or his rabbi. And I love the fact that this rabbi, who happens to have the same name, Yehoshua, explains that basically real good quality salt cannot lose its saltiness. Could it be that Yeshua the Messiah wants disciples that are good quality salt of the earth, salt of the soil? And he doesn't want us to lose our saltiness in our conversation, in our shalom making or peacemaking, in our ability to reconcile people back to God, in the conversations you're going to have at the bookstore, at the courthouse, in the hospital room, at the mall, at the grocery store, with the cashier, with the employee, the employer of the business you're walking into, the common person that you say hello to or shalom to on the street. We should be having these conversations with people, not to convert them, but to change their perspective and the paradigm of what they think a relationship with God is all about, what it means to become a disciple of a rabbi or Yeshua, the Messiah, what it means to follow in the footsteps of someone who's leading and guiding you in a path that they have been discipled in. You see, the world is completely confused about faith, and especially what they call organized religion. I always question that. So you don't like organized religion. Does that mean you like disorganized religion? Because really, to be organized just means to be disciplined. And to be disciplined means to be a disciple. If you're willing to allow someone to pour into your life, you're going to learn from the master himself how to be salty in your conversation, how to be that, not just a preservative of the food that someone partakes of. Truly, we want them to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and you need that saltiness in the food, and you need to be able to have that saltiness in the food make you thirsty for the water of the living word. But even deeper, what's the purpose? The purpose is not just to preserve, but to purify, to be that antiseptic, to be that cleanser, to be that element that changes the environment. You are the catalyst of change in any given situation. You can change the conversation, you can add a little bit of salt, or you can even add a little bit more shalom to balance out the flavors, like a good cookie dough. Come on, you need the salt to heighten the sweet. The salt of the soil heightens the flavor of the vegetables or the fruits. And that's what we do with the world. It's like the famous Jewish Hebraic dictum, tikkun olam, which means to fix the world. When people ask me, well, how do we fix the world? I always say, you fix the world one person at a time, starting with yourself. It's time to get our salt back. It's time to get our conviction back. It's time to get our shalom back. It's time to preserve and to purify, to be that antiseptic, to be that fertilizer of the soil, to make it richer, to make the minerals in the soil, cause the flavor of the taste to be more rich, that people can taste and see that the Lord is good. Man, this has been such a great topic. I wish I could go deeper today, but just like Rabbi Yehoshua, who said that really a good salt can't lose its flavor, just like a mule can't produce a child, just like Yeshua, who said that's salt that doesn't have flavor, it's good for nothing because it's not strong enough in its minerals, to be the fertilizer for the soil, to be that salt of the earth or salt of the soil, or to even cleanse the dunghill. Man, we got a lot of dunghills in our life, don't we? A lot of dunghills in our world, a lot of manure. Now, if you cleanse the manure, guess what? It has great potential to re-fertilize the earth or the soil. We've got to take what seemingly is negative and turn it into a positive. We've got to take things that are lies and realign it with truth. We have to take those negative, toxic emotions and line it up with the fruit of the Holy Spirit. We have to become that disciple that Yeshua can trust in any given situation, that we will be the salt of the earth. All right. Can't wait to see you on episode 10. So excited. I think we're going to jump into what it means not only to be salt, but what it means to be light. Man, get ready for another mind-blown expression. I hope you walk away with a new, fresh meaning of what it means to be the salt of the earth, and truly trust that if you're a disciple of Yeshua, not only trying to be the salt, you are the salt. You just change everything by your presence. Be who God created you to be, with your image and your identity intact, and walk in the footsteps of the one you know you're following with confidence and boldness. And let every conversation from this point on have a little bit more salt in it. And ultimately, you will have the shalom you're looking for, and there'll be peace on earth, goodwill towards men when you're walking the footsteps of Messiah. See you next time. Shalom. Lehitrot.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, follow us for more episodes as you rate and review the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Brian Baruch Balechi. Shalom. Lehitrot. See you next time.